Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Umang Patel, and we have an exciting topic and an esteemed guest on our show today. Our guest today on the show is Dr. Khalid Lateef. He's one of the finest professors of computer science at Harrisburg University. So, Dr. Lateef, can you please introduce yourself to the viewers?
Absolutely. First, Umang, thank you so much for inviting me and having me on your podcast. I really appreciate that. I realize we have been exchanging messages in terms of setting up sometimes. So I was really looking forward to it. And finally, the day is here. So thank you. Thank you. Yes. Yes. A bit about me. So I have kind of looked into experienced different aspects of computer engineering, after graduating. My background is in electrical engineering. That was my
Okay.
undergrad, and then my master's degree. And then there was a little aspect in me that always pushed me towards computer engineering and specific, how do we build software, optical level. So I would be kind of giving away my age by saying that started my first PC was actually Apple II, and
Wow.
uh, and I got a hold of Apple II with two floppy drives, 5/4 inch, and one used to hold the app and the other one data. So from
Okay.
then on, I have seen sort of this beautiful emergence of computational devices and associated apps. I
Okay.
remember uh, in our grad school, we got funding and we were working on a Sun Corporation computer, and it had humongous 8 gigabytes
Mm.
of drive.
8 gigabytes of.
And it ran, Unix, and
Correct.
it had 8 gigabyte drive at that time was considered like the best, the the biggest, largest drive system in all the labs around our lab.
For
And
sure.
by the way, Sun Corporation couldn't really make an 8 gig drive. So what they had done was there was an interface called SCSI interface, who will not bore you to, for that. And then there, they connected in the back through SCSI drive 2 gig 4 drives. So
Mm.
four drives with 2 gigs each. So that gave us 8 gigs of drive. So from there, I had grad students around me who were talking about neural nets and the
Right.
stochastic systems, and that kind of shows this long awaited curve of artificial intelligence, or the efforts towards it, over the last, I would say, 30 years, right? At least
Okay.
that I saw. And this is wonderful now with ChatGPT and many other, large language models finally, coming around. So
Yes, it's
this
very
is
open.
thing. And so as you know, we are never satisfied with the current state of affairs. So
Yep.
now that we have something like this, we are now looking forward. We are trying to say, what's next? What's possible? So that's what I wanted to kind of share today with
Sure.
you.
One thing I want to let our viewers know is that you also have a professional background of working at NASA.
That is correct.
Please tell our viewers what was your role at NASA? How many years were you working for NASA? Tell us about that.
So this was an honor and privilege to actually work on some of the most fascinating projects in, I would say, human history. So the first one, while I was still working on my and wrapping up my research
Okay.
towards Ph.D., I got a chance to actually build software system models for International Space Station. So we wanted to see, how things are working, whether there will be delays or not, what kind of fault management system we need to do. So that's
Okay.
how we started. And then there were a couple of simulating software systems that we were, or apps that we were using.
Mm.
And I worked on the very first US module. At that time, of course, it had a generic name called Node 1. However, so this is how NASA naming convention works, that first, you have a generic name, you work on it, and once it gets launched, then, it is given a proper name.
Got it.
Sort of a human way of naming babies or something like that,
Makes sense.
So Node 1 was supposed to be what you call a passageway between different future modules of space station.
Mm,
And I remember the first module, of course, was launched by Russian Space Agency. That was supposed to act as a tugboat, or something that would be used to move space station from one orbit to the next, or maintain its
okay.
and stuff like that. And then US module was launched, and especially the first module, the FGV, was launched, I think, US Central Time at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning.
Okay.
We saw it live. We were like 4 or 5 techies in a big conference room on a tube
Yeah.
T.
That
Uh,
must have been an
yeah,
amazing experience.
it was. It was definitely amazing experience. So Space Shuttle was still around, and so Node 1 was launched, and later on it was named Unity.
Unity. Okay. Is that still
In
around?
a poetic way. What's that?
Is that program or is that shuttle still around?
No. So shuttle, as soon as space station was completed, then due to many different reasons, shuttle program came to an end. In some
Okay.
ways, space shuttle was designed for building space station,
Okay.
because it had the appropriate space to carry those huge modules in its cargo bay,
Okay.
and provide a stable surface, especially in the beginning when space station was kind of small, that
Okay.
astronauts could use its cargo bay, open up its covers, and then use that as almost like a workbench, a giant workbench
Mm,
in space.
okay.
So I worked on it, evaluating and assuring its software that was running Node 1
Understood.
Unity. So then Space Shuttle continued on. I worked a little bit on a couple of follow-up modules. Then I moved to some other exciting projects. And, for example, I also looked at the software and did the evaluation for James Webb Space Telescope.
Oh, wow.
So that's another really interesting project where, I learned a lot about physics. You know how computer engineers are, or electrical engineers. We don't know the real science, which is the physics and mathematics, to some degree.
Yes.
So that was another really interesting project. And of course, now James Webb is in space, right? And it's doing its own discoveries. And there are some really interesting discoveries that I could occasionally go back and kind of follow up and see what's
Okay.
going with that. So, and then there were many other projects, which came in between these two systems.
For sure. So to pivot us off to our the topic here today, I want to ask you a very simple question because of your background at NASA. Do you think there is an intelligent life outside of Earth?
Oh, I would be reproducing, what you call views of many of the giants in that field of astrophysics and astronomy. So, I'm sure you are familiar with
Dr. Neil?
many of those. As far as intelligent life is concerned, we're considering the probability, like number of planets that may exist, right? Or number of solar systems comparable to our solar system that may exist. It's quite possible, yes. They really will that. So I guess the next question I'm assuming you may have, or people have is that, okay, well, so we got talk about intelligent life, right? Then what phase of that intelligent life,
Yes.
in terms of civilizational perspective could be? So that could be another follow-up question, like, okay, so are they building pyramids now? Or they have built, uh, AGI in,
Says
thousands
that.
of years ago. And at this stage, they are even gone beyond that humanity probably on Earth, on planet Earth, will reach, 1,000 years from now. So
Mm-hmm.
they have a Roman civilization that spanned 2,000 years. What systems did they evolve during that civilization? Did it collapse?
I think
Right?
this is
By
a
another,
huge mystery. I think we're still missing
yes,
lots of pages in the humanity, in the book of humanity, I would say.
absolutely.
We still don't know some
Hmm.
of the parts, and it's still a mystery, I think. Okay, so on that note, I want to ask you, the concept of the true knowledge test when it comes to humans. So I think when we were talking earlier, right, the true knowledge is set to set you free. So the question I have for you is, how would you define true knowledge in the context of artificial intelligence and human learning? And why do you think it is very important?
Oh, that's a philosophical topic. I don't think I probably will be the best person to define it, but I can definitely share what I view as the true knowledge
For
test.
sure.
So, one of the things that humans do is that they are in a continuous path of improving their understanding of nature, this universe, our own self. I mean, some of the philosophers in this area, like Yuval Noah Harari and many other philosophers, they probably have said much better than what I would say here. And that is, you know, imagine this. We can go back 100, years, and killing a tiger was something considered, a grand
Right.
expedition, right? Whether it was a raja or a king or a British military officer, they would ride these elephants, and they would just go, kill a tiger. And then human understanding developed about it, and we said, well, it's just a large cat. Why on earth we would go and what you call kill this beautiful creation? So it kind of human understanding slowly matched with what the sages were saying for a long time, that respect life and
Yes.
believe in truth. But I feel that once sages have said that, humans have to develop understanding to get there. And that is true pretty much in every aspect of our life, that when we develop, you know, good understanding, and when I say good understanding, it can be defined on different levels.
Yes.
The final form of good understanding is, in fact, coming up with mathematical models. So once we develop a mathematical model, and I feel somehow that, like people like Yuval Harari, they have said in like his book about Homo Deus, it actually says, that future of humanity is that, will be augmented,
Mm.
right? Essentially, that augmentation will be based on understanding of all the algorithms that humans use inside us, in our brain, for example, to understand things around us with the way we build our mental models.
So, do we have an idea? I know, like, the neural net, right? That's the foundation of this large language models, right? That's how it's built.
Mhm.
And it's basically, projecting, coming from our human brain and how we think. So, do we have, from your understanding, an idea of how a human thinks and how a human
Oh,
learns? I know it's more of like that reinforcement learning is what we would call that in our computer science field. But is that how we learn, or is that how we think, or I want to know?
Well, there are two aspects to it. One is our existing pyramid-like understanding, of how we go from individual bits and pieces of data all the way to developing sort of wisdom, right? So there is this pieces of data, we collect it, it becomes information, and then we put some context on it, it becomes knowledge. And then once we take that knowledge, practice it over time, and then it becomes wisdom.
Wisdom.
So that is a typical trajectory or an arc on which humans go through to learn and develop their understanding. And that is true pretty much for every field.
Right.
That's one aspect.
Okay.
The other fascinating aspect is something that I forgot the name. The co-founder of Neuralink.
There.
I think
Not
it's
Elon Musk.
not Elon. Elon Musk was the co-founder from the funding and general ideas point of view, but the other one is another gentleman who had deep understanding and background in human electronic interface development.
Okay.
Like how do we connect, I don't know, a cell or maybe on a higher level, a muscle to some electronic control and then either monitor, the behavior of a muscle, a human muscle or a cell. There is a podcast, by the way, Lex Friedman, and the gentleman's name he was there on that podcast, and it was just fascinating to listen to him. And, this is the Neuralink co-founder and Lex Friedman. So I would highly recommend listening to Neuralink implant. So he had extensive experience in terms of how you can interface with neurons. All
Okay.
right. And if you listen to his podcast, he actually shares a lot of interesting observations that how neurons work. And it's almost at the level of molecules now that we're talking about, or level of photons that we are, observing. And so that's another biological part of human learning, right? The other one is the philosophical part that we talked earlier. If we develop, when we develop our knowledge, and hopefully we get to wisdom at some point, and that is that we will, once we develop that understanding, it reduces our fear because fear comes from unknown things.
I agree.
So if we develop understanding, it means that now we know. And if we know, we have lower level of fear. That's where the true knowledge sets us free because we are now free of this human characteristic, which is with us, fear of unknown. I mean, that's what perhaps is part of our evolution, part of our survival instincts. So
I
once we develop understanding about other animals, like whales, maybe, then suddenly, even though whale could be a 1,000 times bigger than a human, or an elephant, right? But there is no fear. We can interact with them. The same thing is true for interacting with fellow humans. Maybe they belong to a different tribe or a different nation, or so if we develop that good understanding, then our fear level will go down and we will be much more accepting the other cultures, other humans.
Mm.
And so that's where the goal is for understanding and training, and LLMs, and also going towards AGI. That one of the tests would be that once the AGI is here, there is lower level of fear in human society.
It would become normal for us humans to interact with this AGI
Exactly.
technologies.
Absolutely. So, one of the futuristic view, which has been there by Douglas Adams, in the Hitchhiker's Guide to Galaxy,
Galaxy, yes.
that you can travel through galaxy as somebody who would be very similar to an explorer, right? With moving through different parts of a region or galaxy or beyond. I will give you another example. There's a beautiful novel by a German author, Hermann Hesse, and the novel's title, I believe, is just Siddhartha.
Okay.
It is actually set in the background of Indian subcontinent, and Siddhartha gets its, how can I say, the motivation or model from Buddha. So Siddhartha is a young man, and he's walking, traveling through Indian subcontinent, going from town to town or places to places, and discovering in search of truth. So the same thing then we can apply to the protagonist in Douglas Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide to Galaxy. And then, of course, there's always a techie part. And this time it is like, I keep on forgetting the name, but this is an electronic gadget that you put in your ear.
And you were into.
And yeah, and then you can understand all the language of the universe. You can communicate with everyone in the universe. So
Isn't that scary though?
again, as long as we learn our being scared or being fearful goes down, right? So in some ways, that is like a futuristic way of existence, human existence, that it is now expanded across galaxy, and it is
Okay.
interacting with what you mentioned earlier about aliens being there or not. So perhaps we are, as humans, would be interacting with those aliens, but since it is based on much deeper understanding of nature, of universe, that I feel that it will be much more, peaceful, as opposed to two different tribes or two different civilizations or two different, species coming together. And the first thing is, each one of them is suffering from the fear of the other, because both of them are worried about their own survival, and as that's why it is just a survival instinct to become fearful. But if it is
Understood.
based on deeper understanding, then things will be much better. So
Okay.
that's what the positive future that I envision, and definitely AGI will help
Well,
us in that
for
direction.
sure. I think that's very beautiful, to be honest with you. And on that positive future which you envision, I want to ask, with large language models, there's training of data, training of knowledge that we provide for it to learn and mimic this human behavior and think like a human would think, right? And so this brings us to the topic of ethics, right? I think this is one of the most important topics, and there are lots of laws happening, some changes happening in different states in the United States and also across the world. So my question is, how could we ensure that our large language models or LLMs in these educational systems would foster this positive outcomes based on the data that we provide, based on the context we provide, and we avoid the bias in that data, and right? And we want the positive outcome, which I'm referring to, would be, love, respect, affections, all of these positive traits that a human would, give importance to.
I think it will come across at different levels. I'll give you this example from electrical engineering. So Michael Faraday, long time ago, discovered that if you change magnetism, it generates electricity. So if you change magnetic field across an electric conductor, and then you attach some kind of measurement device at the end of the wires, or maybe connect a light bulb, and then you move the magnet, at fast enough rate that you will see the light bulb turn on, or the electrical measuring device will show on the needle that, hey, there is some electricity being produced. However, Michael Faraday himself didn't like mathematics. All right. So even though he made this observation, he couldn't put that into a mathematical model so that the whole behavior can be reproduced. Like
Okay.
you change how much what's the strength of magnetic field, all right? How fast it is moving, and then how much current are we producing based on the resistance present, which is always present in the electrical conductor, which is actually receiving the change of magnetic field across its, being. So we had to wait for another great, great, and my role model, a Scotsman, James Maxwell,
Okay.
came along and he presented 4 mathematical equations, which are the most beautiful and elegant representation of electromagnetic, behavior and light behavior.
What
Um,
are these four
so
mathematical
these are the 4
equations?
equations. So the first equation is about Gauss's law of static charge.
Okay.
So in simple terms, it's a complicated thing in terms of a lot of derivatives in it and all that stuff. But in simple terms, Gauss's law and Maxwell slightly modified it. So it said that if there is a static charge, right,
Okay.
that static charge will have an electric field around
Mm.
it.
Which is
Okay.
why when you try to touch, when you have that energy, it gives you a shock, right,
All
from
right.
a
So that's
small
the next
distance.
stage. Yeah, that's the next stage, right? So there are 2 basic laws, right? The first 2 laws, or the first 2 equations of Maxwell, they actually talk about one, which is the static electric charge, and the other one, which actually talks about static magnetism. Why?
Okay.
Because these 2 equations then get used in the following 2 equations.
Really?
All right. So Gauss's law was for the static charge we just talked about. The second equation talks about static magnetism.
Okay.
So that means you cannot have a monopole, means you cannot have a magnet with just North Pole or South Pole.
Or a South Pole. Yes.
It has to be both North and South, and the field will appear to come out of one pole and go towards the other pole.
Kind of like a big Earth, which is a giant magnet, right?
Yes, yes. So, and then of course, those are the kind of behavior that was already studied, like in Gauss's time, but the mathematical understanding wasn't there. And what mathematical equations do is they allow us to model and run simulations, and thus allow us to design whatever we want to design based on those mathematical equations, right? So now human knowledge moved from simple observations and static observations to mathematical equations.
So that it
So the
can be
first two, yeah,
understood and reproduced as well.
we can reproduce, we can verify. So those were the first 2 laws: static electricity and static electric charge, and the static magnetism. So then these 2 laws were then used to actually define the following 2 laws. And one of them was that Faraday actually had already experimented, and it was well known that when you move a magnet in the presence of electrical conductor, then there is a current that gets produced in that electric wire.
Mm,
So James Maxwell then wrote this beautiful equation to represent that behavior. And guess
understood.
what? The exact opposite is also true. If you change electricity or electric current, right? Not static. If you change electric current in a conductor, it produces magnetism.
Yeah, I think this electricity and this
Magnetism. Mm-hmm.
the magnetism or the magnetic field,
Mm-hmm.
it's interconnected, I would say, right?
They
They
are
are, and
absolutely.
it,
Yes.
okay, understood. I think if I remember from the very popular podcast on Joe Rogan, Terrence Howard,
Mm-hmm.
he often brought the topic of how magnetism is an electricity in a way,
Yes, Tim.
right? I think that was one of the hard topics of the Joe Rogan's podcast. Understood. Okay. So what I want to do now is I would want to ask you
Mm-hmm.
some one-word questions.
Sure.
Okay. So in this question, what I would do is I'll say a word,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And what I want you to do is respond with the first word that comes to your mind,
Oh my.
okay? All right, you ready for the first word I have?
Okay.
It's innovation,
Change, complete change of the existing understanding.
ethics,
Making sure that what we do results in flourishing of humanity.
future,
We should all look forward to greater understanding of universe.
bias,
Bias could be positive or negative. Negative bias, that means it impacts our understanding by reducing it or pushing it within a much smaller level or much lower level. Positive bias, on the other hand, is it should encourage us to actually learn more.
on that segment. What about learning?
Learning is something that is innate to humans.
Okay.
I
What about knowledge?
believe, yes, our quest is for knowledge based on learning. And it seems like human babies, and this is not my, statement, but even some of the linguistic understanding grades, they actually have already talked about, that human babies are born with these learning structures in their head, and whether it is genetic, whether it is evolutionary, combination of both, but somehow we are blessed with that, and that allows us to quickly grasp to whatever language is being spoken when we are growing up in our first few years, and that is the start of learning. And even holy books talk about, some this innate behavior by saying, so then there was a word. That's my paraphrasing of a biblical statement or biblical verse. There was a word. So it means is that humans actually have that innate ability to capture concepts and abstract concepts and give it a name. And sometimes that name comes from centuries of experience. So, for
Mhm.
example, there is a weather phenomenon in the northern hemisphere. And if we use English to express it, I have to look it up, by the way. If we have to use English language to express it, it may take 1 to 2 sentences. But if we go to the northern hemisphere, local people like Inuit people, right? They have just one term to express that. Similarly, some of the ancient, what you call civilizations, and like we can go to Africa, and then there are certain African languages which will capture human thought in 2 or 3 words that we may use one full page to express it. So, in other languages. In the
For
same
sure.
way, yes, in the same way, if we go to Sanskrit, for example, and we look at some of the ancient ideas, we can pick up one word. And so that
You would
means,
have an entire sentence sometimes.
yes, exactly. So this is something which is innate to humans, that whenever they go through this long learning process, their effort is to capture more and more of these ideas and put them together so that these ideas can be expressed much quicker. And that's where proverbs, cliches, stereotypes, all those things work, mostly in positive and occasionally in a negative way.
And then the last word that I had for you was
Mhm.
technology.
Yes. Well, technology is just a human expression of their understanding. And I can just go back to the 4 equations of Maxwell. I can say
Okay.
it's technology. Why? Because every aspect of the life that we have right now, which we can call technology, but we can also say those are Maxwell equations
Okay.
or
Very interesting.
Maxwell equations.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Now, I think what I want to talk about, and this is something that we've talked about, and this is a very interesting subject of mine as well, is about robots.
Mhm.
Okay. So in the robotics field, there are three main laws, right? And you can shed light onto the actual name of Isaac. Isaac's laws, the three laws of robotics,
Isaac
right?
Asimov, yeah, in his
Yes, Isaac Asimov's.
novel I, Robot, yes, he lists those 3 laws. I have to
Right.
look them up, even though I have understanding. And the first law is, but don't sit around and not take an action. And as a result, your humans around you will get hurt, right? And then what you call, I have them in front of me in the notes. So a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. That's the first law. Second law was a robot must obey orders given to it by human beings, except where such order would conflict with the first law, right? And then a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection doesn't conflict with the first and second law.
Makes
So
sense.
this was Isaac Asimov's effort to give us some philosophical underpinning that if we are developing robots to help us around with tasks that are difficult for humans or dangerous for humans, that we can. I believe that now, in some ways, we may have gone way beyond those three laws.
So you think they're not relevant?
They will still provide the foundation of any AGI that we develop.
Okay.
And that's where even I feel that these laws are relevant, that if we are training our LLMs,
Mm-hmm.
like you probably saw that when we train LLMs with a bias, that if we ask, like I think it was Google, Gemini, or something, had that issue where somebody said, okay, well, show me the founding fathers, right? And the whole fiasco after that, in terms of not showing the actual founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson or James Madison or George Washington, but instead it had Google's own view or our postmodern view of who
Mm,
the founding fathers should be. I believe
understand.
that's where we should avoid. If we keep on doing that with LLMs, I believe that it may impact AGI as well, and that's where our original aspect of discussion was that it should always be based on truth, no matter what.
Well, how do we know what truth is? Because sometimes, how do we verify? Like, how do we cross-check the truth, right? From the actual thing,
Yes,
especially when it's humans, right? Every person would have his own
bias, some
truth,
innate bias.
some
Yeah,
bias, right? So how do we get that?
that's a difficult question, and I believe much more famous thinkers than I am, or they have struggled with that idea. I would say um, there are different ways to cross-check, right? A really
Hmm.
simple way would be that you go to multiple sources,
For sure.
right?
The simplest way.
That's the simplest first step towards making sure that we cross-check our information and there are multiple folks, and then each one of those authors may have some bias, but then if you start comparing them with much larger set, and I think that's where LLMs can really, really help us if we train them right, that they can actually cross-check multiple sources and then extract from it, hopefully with training and the right rules, of operation, to cancel out most of those biases. And what we are left with is the actual, crux of the matter. That's one. However, lately I've been thinking about another aspect of knowledge,
Okay.
which we could explain in two different ways. One is meta knowledge,
Okay.
or in simpler terms, knowledge of knowledge.
Like a metadata about
Exactly.
data about the
Or the
data.
structures under which we gather the knowledge, right? So we talked about,
Hmm.
collecting data and then turning into information and then, putting proper context and then it becomes knowledge. But looking at those rules in a much closer way and perhaps even using some of those rules to extract some structures which were unknown so far.
Okay.
So we talked about history, for example, right? So founding fathers,
Hmm.
the LLMs getting bias, and so one of the things that we can do is try to understand why humans do what they do.
I think that's a very tough question.
So a lot of times, and this is where history was really boring subject for me, but because it was just a collection of a year and then some war happened in that year.
Me.
Okay. So from there, if we continue discussing that, understanding would be that it was purely for the gain, purely for the objective of defeating another tribe. That's why the war was fought. But lately I'm developing this no, it was not to just defeat another.
Okay. So what would the other reason might be?
So humans, for their survival, and again I will refer to a podcast by by Yuval Harari, but there are other thinkers too, where humans have this concept of delayed gratification. Okay, and here's the example that he gave. So he said, well, with chimpanzee, you can actually, humans can trade with chimpanzees. They can say, okay, I'll give you 2 bananas, you give me 1 apple, or something like that, right? However, you cannot convince a chimpanzee to say, give me 5 apples, and then in the afterlife or in the heaven, you will get 15 bananas, right? So this is an indication of human beings trying to look at an abstract thought that if I'm trading with another person, what is in it for me in the longer term? Not just an immediate goal, but longer term. So the world has been organized for the longest time to actually produce certain products, could be textile, could be silk, could be spices, mostly in the eastern part of the globe. Okay. Whereas the consumption was global. So people consumed them locally, the textiles or clothing or something and spices, but then they also exported it.
Makes
Why?
sense.
Because other people wanted to use it. So in that whole concept of trading, there were much bigger trading routes. At each point in that trading route, there was a checkpost that ensured safety of the businessmen who are taking stuff from one point to the other. And what people did, they actually charged for providing that safety. Now that you have charged somebody for safety, if somebody does in fact harms that traveler or trader through your zone, you have to go for a fight. So in other words, the clash between different tribes or groups or civilizations was not just a blind effort to defeat the other person and then win the territory. No, it was to provide some kind of control and semblance to the trading part of this global connection. And so you will read this whole idea about Alexander the Great, that he was the great general, and he started from Macedon, and then he captured areas all the way to the western parts of Indian subcontinent. But why?
Why did he do that? We didn't ask.
Yes. And the reason goes back to the Bronze Age. So bronze is made of certain parts of copper mixed with certain parts of tin. So where you find copper, you may not find tin. So tin could be somewhere else. So now you need to trade or transfer certain amount of either copper to where tin is, or where copper is and you want to bring tin there.
Okay, yeah.
So essentially, copper was mostly just, well, it was all over the world, but in Greek islands, there was a lot of copper, but not enough tin. So where would you find tin? In the northeastern parts of Afghanistan. So if you track Alexander the Great's route, it will be along that same line. So he was trying to secure Bronze Age tin supply. So something similar to now modern, navies are trying to secure supply of oil. So that's, in other words, if we go one step beyond than just saying, oh, these two people fought and one person won. The next question to ask is why? Was there any link to the trade or some other criteria? And then sort that out as much as you can to get to the truth.
Okay.
That's where if we train LLMs to actually to go to the next level. So my hope is that when we go to AGI will be looking at many of these things on the global level, but also on the local level. That why, suppose I'm Faraday and I don't like math, but I have a really great observation of magnets producing electricity. Well, then
Okay.
AGI should help me instead of James Maxwell. AGI should help me bring the mathematical model of my observation by
So you're
asking
s-
millions of questions.
so you're saying that if you're not strong in one particular subject, whether that's math, right? AGI should be that assistant, and that should come help you. Like, hey, this
Yes.
is my observation in a universe. Help me figure out the physics. Help me figure out
What
a
are the
an equation that you can give it to somebody else, and then they could replicate it, and
yes.
they could get the same observation. And if that AGI or a system can do that, that means my observation is correct. Is that fair to say?
That, and then we can now imagine that human knowledge will expand exponentially. Because if I am Michael Faraday and I have made this observation and I have an AGI assistant, and
Okay.
AGI assistant gave me, and by the way, Michael Faraday dies or he makes this observation and then nothing more happens after that
Mm.
until James Maxwell comes along. So there is this break in the observation and the mathematical model that we could have bridged in, you know, in a much smaller time frame and allowed Michael Faraday to come up with the next idea beyond that, right? So in other words, the things that we did in 200 years from observation to mathematical modeling, we can do that in a few seconds.
That's very powerful.
And if we can do that, that means if I am Michael Faraday, I will move to the next level of questions. And
100%.
so that's where we can have this question answer constantly going on. And that way, the systems that we are developing, in 50 years or 10 years or 20 years, they can be developed instantly.
Okay, so and I think you brought up a great point earlier as well, okay, that when we have these AI systems like AGI, our understanding, the knowledge that we have in our human brains would exponentially increase, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, the pace, I mean, imagine that you said about that Saturday example, right? For him, if there was that no AI system, he would have to observe, he would have to study this different math, different subjects. That would take him a long time. But now that he has a system who is super smart, who has all the data in the world, he can learn about a particular subject very fast in a short amount of time and move to the next question.
Absolutely.
So
Yes.
you think so in that case, will our human brains have, or sorry, let me rephrase this. Will these AI systems that we have now, this AGI form, right? Will that biologically affect our human brains?
Most likely, yes, in many ways, which I can't even imagine, but there could be many different ways. One of the things that in the same Lex Friedman podcast about Neuralink, I believe Elon Musk was there as well as separate part of the podcast. I think it is an 8 hour long podcast. Hopefully, we will get to that point as well, that we will have people listening to our podcast for 8 hours, of course, while taking breaks. So one of the things right now is that we are interfacing with CPUs or GPUs through keyboard,
Yes.
which is extremely slow. Like if we are just doing one task using CPU or GPU, 90% of the CPU, GPU capacity is wasted, or maybe more, maybe 95%. Why? Because we are clicking on the keyboard one by one. Okay, well, there are some faster, typing people, but right? But still, CPU is just waiting for us to finish providing the input before it can take an action. If we have a Neuralink-like device connected directly to our neurons, suddenly we can provide the same information without typing.
Okay.
So now the goal is to use our CPU or external device, computational device, which is not in our brain, but so this is like a really a beginning of proper use of external computational ability by having our neurons directly interact with the CPU in order to use them as optimally as possible.
So we are just trying to, the technology of Neuralink will enable us to be much more efficient, right?
Yes.
In terms of that, the computational consumption, as well as the amount of time it takes as well, right? That's like when your neurons fire up and then you go in, you type, and then your system's waiting for your input as well on the keyboard.
Yes.
It's also wasted. Understood.
So that's where, now, this is just the first stage.
Mm.
Now, could we go to the next stage and design CPUs which are biological, not silicon-based, but carbon-based?
If I'm not wrong, there are those
Efforts
CPUs,
going on.
correct?
Absolutely. Yes. So next step would be then, why do actually have them outside and have all these wires connecting them together? Why not just place them in our brain itself?
Is that dangerous on
Well, this
humans?
goes back to your question, will it change us?
I agree.
So in some ways, that type of capacity will change us, not only make us smarter and change us that way, but also it probably will change us biologically, that we may become augmented humans, who have
Augmented humans.
yes, which will, and could be that we define AGI with a new name, a new interpretation. It is the augmented general intelligence as opposed to anything else.
Very interesting. So the other thing I want to know from you, Dr. K, is with your experience from NASA, right? I've seen use of AI, machine learning in many different fields, healthcare, for example, a doctor going there and then him making the process of understanding the patients, helping the patients easier, education, ChatGPT, right? Technology, agriculture. I want to know from you, what are the use cases of AI or generative AI in space? And where do you think the next step is, like that we should look into maybe for space?
There are so many that we can have a separate podcast about that, right? So we can go in different stages. Okay. So I will draw upon two separate strings of thought.
Okay.
So one is based in fiction,
Okay.
and the other one is based in reality.
All right.
The first fiction, and it's a well-known fiction, so I don't have to explain too much, is the Arthur C. Clarke's work, of Odyssey 2001. So that means Arthur C. Clarke, living in Sri Lanka,
Okay.
is projecting future in 1960s, is projecting the world, which is going to happen in year 2001.
Okay.
Which means that humans are traveling on interstellar missions.
Interstellar missions.
Yes.
Mm.
So, and of course, this was turned into a movie as well, and you can stream that. I'm not sure if you have seen that or not, but the thing is that 1960s people were very romantic about their future and kind of, I would say, rather unrealistic.
I think sometimes those unrealistic dreams or goals could potentially lead to innovative uh, missions and I don't
Oh,
know some
absolutely.
innovative
Well
um,
said. Yeah.
progressions, right?
Well
I think
said.
I think it's important to
Oh,
have
yeah.
those ideas.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I'm a big fan of science fiction. That's precisely why. Um, in some ways, science fiction leads humanity at least 100 years, in some cases even more, or some cases a little bit less, 100 years, 500 years or something.
Okay.
So, talking about space missions, especially traveling to moon, we can imagine a gentleman
Mhm.
sitting in his house about 40 kilometers from Paris
Okay.
in France. And he's writing a weekly or monthly column. And that column is printed in newspapers in Paris, but also its translations are printed in English newspapers in London.
Mm.
Because Paris and London had that historic link, and you can see that, through the classic novels, like, say, by Charles Dickens, The Tale of Two Cities and stuff like that. But anyway, so this gentleman is sitting about 40 kilometers from Paris. He has never been to any other place. He has never traveled, but he has seen a lot of other Europeans traveling around the world and writing down their accounts. So one of the major difference between the, I would say, 16th, 17th, 18th century European middle class men
Mhm.
and the rest of the world, again, affluent men. I'm talking about middle class men who don't have to worry about their food coming, where their food is going to come from next day. So they have enough of funds or maybe food stored in their house that they don't have to worry about, what's going to happen
They're
tomorrow.
financially very stable, yeah.
They are stable financially because one of the longest running theme in human survival in human history is that people were not sure where their food is going to come from tomorrow. So this was
Correct.
the constant fear that humans lived with pretty much for their whole existence, except the last few hundred years.
Mm.
And famines, we can see around the world, there were great big famines where every 40 years or so there would be a famine and the millions, hundreds and thousands of people would die. So those things were innate to human suffering and human psychology, that something bad is going to happen and I'm going to die because of lack of food. So these 16th, 17th, 18th century European men don't have that fear anymore. So they are
Right.
traveling. They're traveling intellectually and also physically. I think both of them are linked. Obviously, there are some ill effects of that. Colonization happened during the same time. Capture of, and destruction of many of the existing civilizations happened at that same time. So I'm not romanticizing that period. I'm just looking at one specific aspect, and that is a person who doesn't have to worry about his or her food tomorrow. What are they doing in their time, right? So here is this gentleman who has in this belongs to the same category, and he's about 40 miles from Paris, and he reads a lot of accounts, and then he pens these weekly or monthly columns in newspaper. And you have heard, I'm sure, the name of that. So ultimately, those columns are combined together, and the book's name is 80 Days Around the World. And it was turned into a movie. And the gentleman's name was Jules Verne. He wrote many other books. The reason why his name came up to me was that he wrote the book called To the Moon and Around. So this is a fascinating book because the book was, let's say, a few years here and there, about 1865. So this book is about traveling to the moon, getting ready, and then traveling to the moon. When did it actually happen?
That's how space
So
exploration is
that means
happening.
around 100 years gap between, or 100 years delay between humans thinking about something and then implementing those systems to accomplish that task. And of course, there are so many other examples. If you watch old Star Trek TV show, I will claim that I was one of those kids who actually watched those Star Trek TV shows, on regular basis because I was fascinated with the technology, as you asked earlier about technology.
Yeah.
And one of the thing was some of the technologies shown in Star Trek, they have been implemented already. Some we haven't. So one of the thing was about communication device,
Mm,
which was something very similar to a flip phone.
okay.
So you flip it open and you speak in it, and that's how you communicated.
And this was unrealistic at that time,
Oh,
but
yeah.
nowadays it's very common, like how we are communicating right now.
Yes. So if we had somebody if somebody who lived in that period and didn't see today's period, if we actually bring that person now back to life, that person will be ecstatic because he saw something as science fiction and now it's a reality. And the same thing is true that Jules Verne would be completely flabbergasted or excited or whatever human, emotions are, that he wrote something where 100 years before, in 1865, he says that a bunch of ex-army men, U.S. army men,
Mhm.
who just got out of army because Civil War has just ended. And they are in the city of
Right.
Baltimore. And they are actually they are planning to actually design a rocket ship which will take people to the moon. And why are they doing so? Because they were gunners. So that means they knew how to send a projectile over a long distance of time with great
Mm,
accuracy. And they felt that we can do the same thing. We can design a shell which will contain humans in it. And we will put that shell in a giant gun and then fire it. And that shell will travel out of Earth's gravity and it will end up in the moon. And of course, they thought about a lot of other things as well.
mhm,
Why Jules Verne were writing that book? Because at that time in US, there was a great scientific work going on. And one of
mm.
them was, I believe in the state of Colorado, there was like this telescope was being built to observe, largest telescope of the world, which was being built. So
Wow.
and then there were these technology, things. And guess what? They finally put that gun together. And which state they go to? Florida. So
That's
they were about 100 miles off from the future NASA launch center in Cape Canaveral, or maybe 200 miles, because they designed their launch pad on the west coast of Florida, the Gulf Coast of Florida, as
mm,
opposed to Atlantic coast of Florida.
right.
And they built a giant gun, which is obviously now is basically designed to be in a large hole in the ground because you can't have one large gun like that, outside on the surface. So
Right.
then they actually place the capsule in there, and there are people in that capsule, and then they put a lot of gunpowder underneath it, and they light it up, and the shell is shot into the space.
A rocket.
Yes. So except now we have slightly different variation of that. Instead of having an underground gun, we actually have that gun sort of attached to the shell. At least in the initial phase, we actually keep it attached and fill that with a lot of gunpowder, right? And then, when we shoot it. So this was done 100 years before the actual, So anyway, I will bore you. This is something. This is like an interesting, aspect of human, view of the future and the technologies that come in.
Well, you still didn't answer the question on
Oh, I'm
what would be a use case you would like to see of AI in the space,
oh,
especially like when we think of space and we think of there's two things, right? One, how does space gadgets like satellites help Earth? So like projecting the weather, things like that. And then the other aspect, which is space exploration, like
mhm.
James Webb Telescope, which you were speaking of. So what would be the use case of AI? Let's say we have an interesting viewer who's watching this podcast and asking, "Hey, Dr. K, I love AI, I
Mhm.
love space, I love the intersection of both, and I would like to take the use case of AI and help in advance the field of space technologies."
There are
Where would he
many
go?
use cases in terms of navigation. That's the easy one.
Okay.
Like when we are navigating across really large distances, right now we are using relatively simple dynamic models to actually guide us from point A to point B. And those are predetermined. Like, for example, if we want to travel from Earth to, so we have a predetermined mathematical set of equations for the orbital dynamics. We program that in and we figure out what's the best time to launch a vehicle from Earth. And considering the relative position and relative orbits, of Mars and Earth, what time should we launch so that it gets there at a specified time? And what is the shortest route to get there? And if we don't follow, then what's going to happen, right? So those are all dynamic models we are using, mathematical equations that we are using to actually design and to pre-plan an orbit, or the launch time and the launch trajectory, which is okay as far as, you know, we are talking about, say, current, set of what you call models and the trajectory for space travel. But what if that trajectory is something that we have to design for places which we haven't really planned for? So AI can definitely, even though we won't need a huge amount of artificial intelligence for that, or it probably could be done relatively simple, especially with futuristic computational devices that could be, a few microseconds or even less. But navigation is something where we can definitely use AI. Exploration itself, in terms of we got to some new solar system. What are we going to do there? Now we are too far away from Earth, from the base
Yeah.
stations. So even now, for Mars, communication takes, I believe, 6 minutes or something each way, or 9 minutes, depending upon where the excuse me, relative positions are on the two orbits for Earth and Mars. But then, we can design, and AI will definitely help in space exploration. So navigation is one area, redesigning, route planning. How do we get there? How do we adjust our what you call systems to a place where the gravitational forces were not known beforehand? How to land in some new place? How to decide which place to land on a new planet. So those will be a lot of computation and a lot of analysis that has to be done on board. And I feel that, AI or perhaps even AGI will be of a great help to prepare people. And then we can go to the fiction side as well. And Odyssey 2001 actually was where an AI-based computer was actually monitoring even the life systems on board for this interstellar travelers, means monitoring health of astronauts or human travelers,
Mm,
and managing them, monitoring them, in terms of their psychological health, not just physical health.
right.
Because now that you are just your own team, 3 or 4 people or 10 people, for example, as space travelers, so what's going to be the impact, when they are on space traveling, for 50 years?
Mm,
How do you deal with life and death situation? Maybe reborn in space. I mean, suppose, we are going across multi-generational interstellar, you know,
indeed.
yes.
I think
So
it's very complicated.
it is. So definitely AI can help. Another aspect is you can't store food for that long, that will be too much of a cost. So that means you have to grow food, on your way, on other planets. How do you decide? Do we have enough of our own knowledge or individual space travelers' knowledge to actually decide what kind of soil is there, how to reproduce food, and what kind? that's where artificial intelligence can definitely help. So there are a lot of different places: health, food, diet, that I think applications are endless. Yeah. And they're fascinating, all of them. In fact, real quick, uh, a couple of years ago, I was driving and I heard on NPR that there is a French effort under European Space Agency where they are actually designing menus and the type of food that we can grow on Mars. And I chuckled. I
Wow.
said, only French can think ahead when it comes to astronomy, not astronomy, gastronomy.
Gastronomy, yes. No, that's another word. No, for
Yeah.
sure. Okay. No, I think those are very interesting applications of AI in terms of space and its technologies. Thank you so much.
Thank
Any
you for,
final
yes.
any final notes for our viewers? Okay.
We should look forward to, um, you know, the best possible period in human existence with all the tools and techniques that we are developing right now for a grand future.
For a grand awesome.